Tonight on Nation to Nation, Jody Wilson-Raybould resigns as Minister of Veteran Affairs, and government leaks paint her in a bad light.
Well, I think it's served to discredit her for sure. That's what the intent is.
The political scandal is taking away from other matters, like the drafting of a new Indigenous child welfare bill. Leaders say the issue of jurisdiction is holding it up.
It's not a true recognition of First Nations authority if you require a ministerial agreement with the province or the feds.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamaran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Nothing has dominated the news more lately than the resignation of Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was the first Indigenous woman to hold a senior cabinet position as Minister of Justice. Last month, she was demoted to Veteran Affairs. And after allegations she was put under political pressure to intervene in a criminal case involving SNC-Lavalin, she resigned from cabinet altogether. Wilson-Raybould was widely respected and considered the chief architect of the government's adoption of laws and policies promoting reconciliation. To speak more about it, we're joined by Chief of the Nisga'a First Nation, Jody Wilson. Chief Wilson, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me today.
A lot has happened, of course, within a week. What were your first thoughts when the story broke last week?
Well, I was disappointed at the same time, but also understanding that Minister Wilson-Raybould is upholding, her ethics and standards in regard to, not negotiating, a criminal charges which his company was undergoing. So the transparency of government is important. The rule of law of government is important, and also that there's accountability for any actions, especially at the highest level like that. So she was standing up for those ethics and standards, which all of our ministers and the Trudeau should also conduct themselves within.
Of course, were a lot of media reports saying government sources said she was difficult to work with. Do you think those are just controlled leaks from the Prime Minister's office?
Well, I think it's served to discredit her for sure. That's what the intent is, misalign her or discredit her. When she was regional chief here, she operated in a very professional and way, had a lot of the nations working together. I'm not saying there weren't differences and disagreements. We're outside of the treaty process, for example, in our nation, and some of the other bands are pursuing it, but in our communities we're not, and we're not self-government. So those had to be respected. So we had respectful differences in those approaches, but most part she conducted herself in a very professional way. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. Let's figure out how do we deal with these issues and respect the diversity of our nations, which out in BC we have a lot of different diversity and approaches. But a large part of our nations in BC, we're outside of the treaty process and we're outside of self-government.
Do you think, to go back to how she's been characterized in the media from these leaks, do you think a man or a non-Indigenous person would have to deal with such things?
Well, it happened to me at the Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa, and I'll give you that example. I was asking the Trudeau a question about reconciliation. How could they do that when they're pushing through the Trans Mountain Canada pipeline, and our Secwepemc proper title holders did not give consent. Well, he right away says, "Well, Judy, just because people don't agree with you," and started dismissing the issue, belittling me, not using my proper title as Cookbee or chief of my community, so I felt he treated the minister the same way. And right behind me at the mic was another chief, Chief Lee Spahan, who in the next breath, Trudeau said, "Oh, I apologize to you," in Chief Lee Spahan. So I was wondering, how could he treat a male chief this way and then a female chief this way? And to me, he's doing that to the minister as well, in how he's reducing and not being professional to her. I don't know why his conduct and behavior is like that. I had requested an apology in an open letter, and I've never received it to date.
This resignation and how he treated, or how the sources say Jody Wilson-Raybould was treated, how much damage do you think this does to his government and Does it affect his re-election chances?
Well, it's really ironic. The United Nations just did a ruling on international law on sex discrimination in the Indian Act. I mean, that's wording in the Indian Act and saying, okay, Indian Act, you got to get up with the human rights level. And then we have Trudeau, the highest office of the land, treating our women and our people like that. And, you know, there's serious issues with, you know, how he conducted himself. And I agree that, you know, the investigation has to happen with, you know, with those criminal charges against that company, because there needs to be accountability and responsibility. Well, also there has to be conduct and behavior of how the Prime Minister's office and the Trudeau himself is conducting himself, you know, to other members, and how they're trying to discredit her and try to shift the blame to her, basically. And that's not appropriate at all. You know, the inner cabinet is supposed to be people that are working on behalf of all of us, and they should be responsible and conducting themselves at that level. It seems very highly inappropriate. It seems also like a dysfunctional type of behavior, a dysfunctional type cabinet. And we hear about those things happening south of us. It's kind of unreal to hear that happening right in Canada. You were supposed to have an ethical, responsible, professional government working for us, and at this point, I can't see it. Yes, I believe it does will weigh into it's a bad timing for the Liberal, but I also think with responsible ministers that can uphold themselves and also show that, you know, they can, you know, take on this level of work and you know, on behalf of us, they'll shine through. And I think it's going to be a mixture of different types. And I was just saying to one of the colleagues today that, you know, we don't have much choice in leadership at that level. We have the Conservatives. What choices do we have there for choices? And the Liberals, you know, what choices do we have there now? It's almost like all of these parties, we don't have choices. I always liked Elizabeth May. I'm kind of a fan of Elizabeth May. So, you know, I've always liked the work she's done. And, you know, NDP, will that improve the polls? We'll have to wait and see. And I think the Liberal Party's got to do a lot of damage control. And the Conservatives, so they got to do a lot more work in saying how they're going to deal with the UN Declaration, Indigenous rights, and the respect and recognition of our title and rights. So, you know, right now it's like, you know, who do we choose? It's going to be a real toss-up.
That's for sure, Chief Wilson, and we'll certainly have to talk more about this later, but I want to thank you for talking to me now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
After the break, we speak to Joel Abram of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians to talk about the proposed child welfare reform legislation. Welcome back. These days, Justin Trudeau has a lot of political fires burning. One is also erupting over a promised child welfare bill. Trudeau said it would give Indigenous people back control over their kids. First Nations have seen a draft of the bill, and they aren't happy. They say it doesn't guarantee jurisdiction or necessary funding, and it still hasn't been introduced in the House of Commons. Joining me to discuss this now is Grand Chief Joel Abram of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians in Southern Ontario. Grand Chief Abram, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
You're part of the working group on this file. What's the major problems with the draft bill that you have seen?
Well, as you had previously mentioned, the two items there are some other minor issues, but I think the major ones are the jurisdiction issue and also the statutory funding. So as it is right now, you know, that was our main concerns going in because we were one of the main opponents of the framework going in because of its model of and sticking to the inherent rights model and basically having First Nations as a fourth order of government. And so that was our concern going in, that there still we'd be trying to utilize that model. And it's not a true recognition of First Nations authority if you require a ministerial agreement with the province or the feds in order to have your legislation or child welfare law recognized. And the other portion, again, is the funding. We're really concerned because of the CHRT decision, as we all know. It said that child welfare is vastly underfunded on reserve as opposed to the mainstream Canada. And we think that through successive changes of government, it should be statutory so that the government just can't go back and start to defund child welfare again. And so those are the two main issues again.
Speaking of jurisdiction, former Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott told us here at Nation to Nation that deals would need to be worked out with the provinces. So why was that such a surprise when you saw this draft bill?
It's one thing to have an agreement with a province or a federal government, but to say that we require that before we can exercise our jurisdiction, that's a non-starter. That's a non-starter. First Nations have the inherent authority to exercise their jurisdiction. What this bill is really intended to do is to ensure that the federal and provincial governments would not oppress First Nation governments who are asserting their sovereignty with respect to child welfare.
It sounds like when you mention it's a non-starter, that if the provinces don't get on board, you don't see this bill working out as you would envision it.
Well, if the federal government sticks to their guns and passes the bill with the amendments that we had proposed, and then that wouldn't be an issue. And then when First Nations have their child welfare laws in place, those would supersede any provincial legislation. And that was the idea from the onset. The previous Liberal government in Ontario, for instance, was on side with that idea. But there are some concerns from the current Ford government, although they are in principle okay with the idea, they have some concerns as to how it's actually going to roll out, which is understandable. But they have to understand our point of view also is that First Nations jurisdiction is not up for negotiation.
How would having complete jurisdiction of child welfare and funding save the lives of Indigenous kids in care? I mean, we've reported repeatedly here at APTN about child authority here in Ontario where a number of deaths have occurred.
Well, part of it is underfunding, chronic underfunding. And the other part that we have to remember is that both the federal and the provincial governments has historically done a horrible job when it comes to child welfare. We have the 60 scoop, we have residential school, we have the millennial scoop. In fact, the rates of apprehension now are greater than they have been in the 60s. So to say that the province and the feds are going to be doing a better job of child welfare is a non-starter for us. And we think First Nations can do a better job, give us back well, not give us back, but let us assume our sovereign and our inherent authority to deal with our children and the proper resources to do that. And I think you're going to see a different picture, especially because we want to focus on prevention rather than apprehension.
So in other words, some of the First Nations authorities that have run into trouble with children dying on their watch, you don't think that would happen just if you had more resources, more funding?
Well, it definitely happens under the watch of provincial CASs for sure. So, I don't think you can bring whether or not it's under First Nations or provincial into that picture, because we know for sure that the provinces, there's been kids that have died, while under the care of provincial mandated CASs. And, what I think First Nations are looking at doing is doing a whole different way of handling child welfare. For sure, First Nations do have to step up in terms of doing the child welfare laws and making sure that what they're going to be doing is going to work. So there may be some speed bumps, but I think handing back that jurisdiction, or at least recognizing that First Nations have that jurisdiction, is a good first step.
It doesn't look like this may get tabled in time. Is it best to just let it die and hope the Liberals get reelected in October?
The only issue is that without this federal legislation, you're probably going to see provinces and CASs oppress First Nations who are going to be attempting to utilize their own laws and resources with regards to their children. So, that's one of the unfortunate consequences. I think reconciliation and his reconciliation mandate, if he's really serious about this, part of reconciliation means listening to the people that you're reconciling with. And coast to coast, we've been very clear with regard to this First Nation child welfare legislation on those two particular issues. And if they're serious about reconciliation, then they will table this bill, because child welfare is too big and important of an issue to let lay wait again. So a lot of work has gone into this, and we'll see whether or not He's interested in reconciliation or continuing the colonial oppression of First Nations.
We'll definitely have to wait and see. Grand Chief Abram, once again, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
After the break, an Aboriginal man from Australia is here to share his success of land management and protection. Welcome back. Indigenous conservation is key to fighting climate change, and Australia has established itself as a leader with its Indigenous Protected Area Network and its Indigenous Rangers program. 45% of Australia's reserved lands are Indigenous protected areas. Valerie Comtois is director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and Dennis Rose is a Gunditjmara traditional owner from Australia. They've been touring the country to help sell this concept in Canada. And joining me now is Dennis Rose and Valerie Courtois. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll start with you, Mr. Rose. What is it about the Australian approach that you think Indigenous people here in Canada can benefit from?
Oh, look, I think the most important thing is that it is about the Indigenous community, the Indigenous landowners, having control of the planning and of the implementation of the management. I think that's first and foremost. It shouldn't be something that's imposed on communities or landowners. It needs to be something that is worked from within that particular community to suit their particular needs and purposes.
Now, I heard it mentioned the term landowners. Is private land ownership something a lot of Aboriginal people in Australia engage in?
It varies around the country. Certainly in the north of Australia, there are vast areas of Indigenous-owned land. Of course, we've never ceded our land, but in terms of the European land system, we have a lot of land in the north, not so much in the southern states.
I suppose, Ms. Courtois, follow up on that question. Of course, a lot of First Nations don't have a fee simple title, of course. So how can the approach with, especially the approach with Indigenous landowners in Australia, how can that translate to First Nations here in Canada?
Well, even though we still have a lot of outstanding claims and processes with the federal government in terms of enacting our own authority over our lands, we do have a very clear sense of what our traditional territories are, and we still remain, our own cultural responsibility remains. And so for me, these guardian programs or the ranger programs are a way for us to express and fulfill our cultural responsibility to our lands, no matter what the current ownership system is. And the more that we have people doing this job, actually the better position we'll be to assert that authority on those lands.
Mr. Rose, as Ms. Courtois mentioned, she used the term rangers. I suppose, why are you described as rangers? What do you guys do?
Our rangers do a wide variety of tasks. A lot of, in Australia's case, a lot of feral animal management. We have some quite large problems, severe problems with feral animals, such as camels, rabbits, foxes. There's a whole list of them. Invasive weeds are another problem. So certainly some rehabilitation of country is extremely important, but also fencing and visitor facilities. Certainly down our way, down home, we put a lot of effort into education programs for the non-Indigenous community, and so it's about making sure we have good facilities, monitoring of wildlife species. There's a whole range of duties that they carry out.
I guess, Mr. Rose, the delegation's been here for how many days? About 4 or 5 days. You've been up to Yellowknife, of course. What have you learned, I suppose, that specifically that could be translated over here to Canada?
Well, certainly the fact that in Australia there is a clear investment on the part of the federal government and has been for 20 years in the case of IPAs and just over 10 in the case of rangers. Right, yeah. That to us is a very real inspiration, and what they've seen in Australia is that there's a clear return on investment for those investments, which we're also seeing here in the existing programs in Canada. We have just over 40 existing programs in Canada, And we've got a federal government who's just dipping its toes into funding those programs. It committed to $25 million in 2017. But what we're really looking for is a nice, fulsome program that really allows to see some of the same benefits that we're seeing in Australia.
Just to mention, again, it sounds like you do have some backing from your federal government for this program.
Yes, we certainly do, and it's been pleasing to receive that support. I think that it's one thing to declare a protected area, but it's another thing to manage it and manage it effectively, and you certainly need the resources to do that. We receive base funding from the Commonwealth Government, and that's supplemented by other funding programs. At the moment, it's working okay, but certainly the will needs to continue and increase. There's a heck of a lot of work that needs to be done, and we need the resources to do it. But it is pleasing. Just with the politics of it all, it's a bit difficult to plan ahead sometimes.
But you're keeping your fingers crossed, anyways. It sounds like.
Yes. Yes.
Ms. Courtois, you said, of course, the federal government is just dipping its toes. You're hoping for more. We're coming up to a federal election, of course, in October. I suppose, does that make it easier or harder to maybe get some sort of promise from the federal government?
Well, the federal government is kind of wrapping its mind around what these programs can do for them as well, and certainly agencies like Parks Canada have been investing in programs. The Haida Watchman program has existed since the 80s. And has done very well in terms of guest services and the visitor experience on that World Heritage Site of Guayhanas. So it really is about figuring out what does a true partnership look like. And for us, we don't want any more government programs. We've been programmed for years, and that's not what we need. We need a true nation-to-nation partnership that allows us to be who we are and to partner with the federal government in a way that respects our own nationhood. And so that's what's interesting about this model, and that's what the government is really dipping its toes into, is trying to figure out what does that really look like on the ground in terms of these stewardship activities.
Mr. Rose, it seems like Australia is on the forefront when it comes to climate change. Even while you've been here, there's been stories back in your home country about the extreme temperatures, the wildfires in Tasmania, for example. Does that make it harder or easier to push forward this approach?
Oh, look, at the moment it is difficult. I think we have the climate skeptics, I should say. We have the climate skeptics that aren't supportive of our programs as much as they should be, and I don't think look far enough forward. I think that's what we're trying to do as a landowner, is to look forward to make sure that the protection we put in place today is robust and enough to withstand those changes that are already happening and will continue to happen.
Well, Mr. Rose, I hope you enjoy the climate while you're here in Ottawa. It's probably colder than you're used to. I want to thank you both for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's our show for the week. And if you missed any part of it, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamourand. Thanks for watching.